I'm going to start out talking about human origins and giving you some background about where the Starchild might fit into the scheme of things here on Earth. It didn't just drop out of a cloud. It, I think, has a place here, a place that you will not be aware of. A lot of what you're going to hear at the beginning now is material that is not really forbidden or hidden or anything like that, but it's very difficult to access because science, you need to understand, is involved in a very pitched battle with creationists over who decides the origins of life and the origins of humanity. The reality of it is, because of that battle, scientists are not able to say, we don't know, we don't understand. They always come up with an answer for everything, and they wait till that answer is proved wrong, and then they come up with a new answer until that one is proved wrong, and that's kind of how the system moves along from a scientific standpoint. But they never are in a position to say, we don't know, because if they do that, then the creationists will say, well, if you don't know, then you should be teaching our information equally with yours, which I'm not for and I don't think should be done. I'm not a creationist. I'm not a Darwinist. I talk about the middle ground. I explore the middle ground. I follow the facts where they lead. And what I'm going to do here in this first hour, hour and a half is lead you along that path and show you things that I think everybody needs to know. And then you can decide on your own if you want to pursue it any further through my book or any other means as time goes by. Okay? With that said, first slide, please. All right, this is the Starchild. This is what you're all here to hear about, and I will talk about it extensively after the break. But for the time being, we're going to move into those other areas that I told you about, but I just wanted you to get a view of it and how weird it is and how unusual it is. I will make clear all the features that you see that look like, you've never seen before. It's just simply a broken off nose, broken off maxilla. But there's plenty to say about the rest of it. It's a truly amazing find. This is the real skull. What you will see later when I show it to you is a stereolithographic copy. There are so few of you here that you will all be able to see it up close, hold it if you want to, and get up close and personal with it. So that's one of the advantages of the small crowd. You can all experience it personally. All right, next slide. This is the beginning, we are told and we are taught, of life on Earth. And for all intents and purposes, life anywhere. Science says that it has to have created itself out of the natural course of events here on Earth. There can be no outside intervention, whether that be extraterrestrial or divine. Everything happens within the Earth and the Earth's mechanisms as we understand them right now today. So what it says is that simple elements like oxygen, carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen form into simple compounds: carbon monoxide, water, formaldehyde, ammonia, hydrogen cyanide. And somehow these things, which are basically they're basically the way things are in the real world, somehow form themselves into much more complex molecules: fatty acids, purines, sugars, nucleotides, and amino acids. Now, the amino acids, I would point out that in the 1950s, there was great celebrating when a scientist used a lot of catalytic elements, putting gases in tubes, putting electrical charges through it, and he got a few amino acids created, and everybody celebrated and said, oh, well, that explains how life came to be. He performed one intermediate step, and he only got a few amino acids, and that's really all you ever get in those experiments. So these do not actually jump themselves together. They don't link electrons and go skipping merrily along. It's hard to put them together. But nonetheless, somehow they did it on their own, and then they did form the even more complex molecules of lipids, DNA, and protein. Now, forget all that and how difficult that is and really doesn't happen in the real world very easily. These somehow swept together and formed themselves into the first living thing. Now, imagine it. Somehow the lipids form themselves into a double membrane when they will barely clump together on the surface of water in normal circumstances. Somehow these lipids that form this double membrane understood that they had to gather up within themselves some strands of DNA, which are not going to be found floating around anywhere. And somehow the DNA knew that to create proteins and use them, and this living cell came out knowing how to feed itself, how the membrane knew how to let nutrients seep through, the membrane knew how to let waste go out, the DNA knew how to create energy, and the cell somehow knew how to replicate itself again and again and again ad infinitum. All at once, all really. This is every bit as miraculous as God did it. There really is no difference. It's as miraculous in its own way as just the creation is saying God did it. Neither one of them are right. It didn't happen that way. What are the odds of it? Next slide. The odds are of a tornado sweeping through a junkyard and creating a Boeing 747. It didn't happen. It couldn't happen. It's impossible. And yet here I stand talking to you, and there you sit listening to me. So something happened. Something happens. And whatever it is, I'm sure down the line we're going to find that it has laws that govern it, whatever it is. Understandable rules and regulations. But we're so far removed from that now and removed from an understanding of it that to us it's going to be absolutely supernatural. As we sit here today, whatever that answer is, totally supernatural. But it won't be creationism, and it won't be naturalism or Darwinism or any of that. It's just going to be something else that I don't understand at this point, but neither do they. But they will both tell you that they understand it perfectly, and they don't. Next slide. What we know happened is this. The Earth coalesced out of the primordial cloud of dust and gas around 4.5 billion years ago. For the first billion or so years, it was just seething lava being bombarded by meteors and asteroids. But amazingly, here at around 4 billion years ago, only about half a billion years, life appears. You see those little circles right there? Prokaryotic bacteria. Prokaryotic bacteria. And surprise, surprise, these things are invulnerable. They can live absolutely anywhere, in any kind of environment, and make it. All right? So they appear, as you see, just suddenly at a time when nothing should be there. It's just seething lava and being bombarded all the time, and yet there they survive, no problem, prokaryotic bacteria. Now, what are the prokaryotes? They are single-celled bacteria with no cell nucleus. They're very simple, but they're invulnerable, but they're very complex relative to that first cell that you saw, that first life form, that first whatever it was. It's much more complicated than that, much more complex than that. Furthermore, you would think that one, and only one, would appear if indeed there was a creation, a natural creation of the first life form on Earth, would you not? But no, it turns out in the late 1980s we discovered that there are two, not one, but two prokaryotic bacteria types that appear on Earth at around 4 billion years ago. Apples and oranges come. Not apples, not oranges, both. Now that doesn't make sense in terms of any kind of natural progression. The only answer for it, and scientists, some will admit it now, is that it came. It appeared here. It was brought here. And they're saying, well, it must have come in on asteroids or meteorites or something like that. It didn't develop here. There's not enough time, just absolutely not enough time. The Earth is too hostile a place, and you get two types of prokaryotic bacteria. It came here, or was delivered here. All right, so it continues on to 2.5 billion years down to 2 billion years. Earth's cooled off now. The seas are pretty much the temperatures as they are today. And you get a new type of single-celled bacteria, the eukaryotes. Now, the eukaryotes have cells. They have a nucleus in their cells. So you have the prokaryotes without a nucleus, and you have the eukaryotes with a nucleus. They're also much more complex much more sophisticated, much larger, the eukaryotes are. How are they explained by science? Science says, well, some of these prokaryotes that were large decided to eat some of the ones that were small, and the ones that were small decided to turn themselves into a cell nucleus, and that's how the eukaryotes were made. That didn't happen either. That's just absurd. The eukaryotes appear when the earth seems ready to receive them, because they're more fragile than are the prokaryotes. So they come when the earth is ready for them, and they too seem to be delivered. Just as with the prokaryotes, strata without, strata with, they just appear. They don't develop from anything unless you believe that story about the large prokaryotes eating the small ones. Then we continue down with just prokaryotes and eukaryotes through 1 billion years to around 600 million years ago when something called Ediacaran fauna appears. Now they are the first complex creatures, more than one cell. We don't know what they were to this day. We don't know if they were plant or animal. We really don't know what they were. So they represent them here as seaweeds and kind of jellyfish, but nobody knows what they were. And then suddenly here at around 530 million years ago, you see these two little lines right here, that little space in there, 5 to 10 million years relative to everything else. Just overnight, a blink, you have something called the Cambrian explosion. Now the Cambrian explosion was so unexpected, so improbable, so otherworldly, that really not even Darwinists pretend that it's a Darwinian evolution kind of thing. Again, things just appear. Next slide. And here it is. You have suddenly the seas being filled in that very short period of time with thousands of new plants and animals. In fact, as far as animals go, it was all 26 phyla that we have today appear in that one nuclear level explosion of life on the planet, the Cambrian explosion. And as you see, none of it looks like life on Earth. It looks like creatures from other planets, which they very likely are. The closest thing we have left to anything from the Cambrian explosion on Earth today is horseshoe crabs, and everybody knows how bizarre they look. Cambrian explosion. Next slide. So from there, we have the full panoply of life, of complex life as we know it on Earth. Now, what are we told? How do we told this happens? It goes from the sea worms turning into fish, the fish turning into amphibians, the amphibians turning into reptiles, reptiles turning into mammals and birds, by a process called macroevolution. And what that requires is for gills to turn into lungs, fins to turn into limbs, and scales to turn into skin, and whole body changes, changes in whole body parts. Macroevolution. And Darwinists insist that this happened because, again, it all happens to it has to happen within constraints that are here on the planet and be explained in terms that are understandable to them, to what they understand now. But in reality, that doesn't happen. It just simply doesn't happen that way. Macroevolution is a great idea, except there's no proof for it. There's not a single shred of definitive proof for macroevolution in 140 years of looking really hard for it. Next slide, please. What Darwin saw to come up with that idea was microevolution. Microevolution. Evolution in parts. He saw creatures on the Galapagos Islands. He saw finches, he saw tortoises, he saw others. And on different islands, they had developed different abilities, different physical abilities to go with the niches that they were in. Now, these are not Darwin's finches because the view of change in the beaks of Darwin's finches is fairly subtle. These are honey creepers from Hawaii. Hawaii is 6 million years old. The Galapagos are only 3 million years old, so they've had 3 more million years of evolution, and you see them much clearer, but it's the same principle. You have the ancestral honey creeper that goes out. You have those that feed on nectar and insects, fruit, and seeds. And so all of these birds still digest like honey creepers, still reproduce like honey creepers. They still are honey creepers. This one didn't turn into a gull or a crow or anything like that. They adapted in part, pieces, adapted in pieces, microevolution. This is what Darwin saw, and he said, well, if you can have microevolution in this little period of time, then over the grand span of time, you can have macroevolution. You can have change in whole bodies, and that was the theory. Everybody bought into that because it makes sense. It's logical. If had I been there, I would have bought into that. Most of you would have. But the problem is, Darwin himself said, if you can't find the transitional species that my theory calls for, my theory has to be wrong. And the transitional species are simply not there. Not there. I think if Darwin were standing here today, even though he's a homeboy, he would be willing to stand up and say, yeah, I made a mistake. I did the best I could under the circumstances. It just didn't work out. But because, again, Darwinists are so locked into that battle with creationists, they can't acknowledge the truth that all of them know. I know this, you can see this, a child can see this. Next slide. What really happens in the course of life is this, and this is a squeezed down version of the course of life, is that it's dominated by catastrophic events, mass extinctions, 5 of them. 5 major, what are called major, and several what are called minor. Now the majors take out anywhere from 50 to 90% of life when it happens. And it pretty much changes the environment of Earth. It's a catastrophe. And those that live, but after a period of time, and it generally is from 1,000 to a few million years, suddenly life begins to proliferate again. And it's generally a different kind of life than was here before, adapted to the new environment, whatever it is. Now, if indeed Darwinism worked, gradualism, naturalism, whatever you want to call it, it would be clearest in these periods after the extinction events, when the fossil record, for all intents and purposes, is wiped clean. It should show up, and they can read those fossil records, and what it shows is very clearly that new things just appear. Just appear. So in the 70s, Stephen Jay Gould and Niles Eldredge came up with an acknowledgement of this gaping hole in the Darwinian theory, and said, they put a patch on it, and the patch was called punctuated equilibrium. Now, if you want to really, really tick off a hardcore Darwinist, start talking to him about punctuated equilibrium. Why? Because it's the truth. And the truth is that things just appear. So the punctuated equilibrium theory is that when Darwinism can go slow, it goes slow, but somehow, after these extinction events, the animals that are left, the creatures that are left, the plants that are left, somehow their genes know they have to hit the accelerator and start speciating wildly into the new niches. And it's been analogized as a kernel of popcorn. A kernel would pop into its piece of popcorn under natural circumstances, and that would be its next step up the ladder of evolution. But somehow after these events, according to punctuated equilibrium, each remaining seed of popcorn, each remaining form of life, knows that it's time to pop itself into a whole big bucket of popcorn, which is absurd. It does not happen. Punctuated equilibrium is the story of what happens, and it's not gradualism, and it's not Darwinism. Things just appear here. And they appear all the way back to the prokaryotes, to the eukaryotes, to the Ediacaran fauna, to the Cambrian explosion. Everything appears. It's as if it's brought here. And that's what I contend, that it is brought here. That the planet is being terraformed, basically. And things come when it's time for them to come. Somebody's watching over the process. Okay, now let's start with that as background. Let's start talking about this guy right here. Let's start talking about humans and how humans came to be here. Next slide. Okay, this sums it up about as well as it can be done. The Darwinian paradigm. Everything else is eat, survive, reproduce, eat, survive, reproduce, and only us have the ability to stand there and say, what's it all about? How could we be so incredibly different from everything else? How could that happen? Well, let's start with this guy right here and take off the tail. The cartoonist probably feels like you do that monkeys preceded apes. You feel that way, do you not? The reality of it is that's not true. Apes, it isn't that there was no monkey-like creatures, but apes dominated in the era called the Miocene, which is around, just call it 20 million years ago. It's much longer than that, but just think 20 million years to simplify it. Around 20 million years ago, you have a period, take the tail off, of 24 ape species with maybe as many as 50 different types. Apes all over the place. all over the place, and all sizes, ranging from the literally giant Gigantopithecus whose head would brush that right there, down to man size, plenty man size, down to small ones like gibbons and orangutans of today. We're talking tailless creatures, apes. Monkeys, very seldom found, not many monkeys out there. Apes dominate through the Miocene. And interestingly enough, a lot of Miocene apes, just as you see this guy right here, they have arms that are basically as long as their legs, and they have grasping hands. Now, he did that just inadvertently, but it turns out to be just about right. Now, what does that mean? It means those Miocene apes are not quadrupeds. They're not incipient quadrupeds. To be a quadruped, your arms have to be longer than your legs for you to move comfortably. All quadrupeds have that, longer arms than legs. So if you've got arms that are about the same size as your legs, you're not making it on all fours very well. You need to be up on 2 feet to be able to move comfortably. But you will not get any anthropologists that will acknowledge that. They insist that all of the ones with the longer arms were not only not bipeds, but none of them survived. All of them went extinct. The only survivors just happen to be the 4 quadrupeds that we accept today: gorillas, chimps, gibbons, and orangutans. That there was no possibility of upright walking all the way back into the Miocene, even though the evidence is pretty clear that it had everything it needed to be happening. Why is that? Because walking is considered to be a human exercise. And so walking is what we claim is our very own, what makes us special in the distant past, and walking has to be learned by somebody with the growing intelligence to do it. So you can't really tell the truth about the Miocene if you want to preserve that image. Okay, next slide. We know that there was a walking, upright, bipedal creature at 3.5 million years ago, because here's the tracks. At Laetoli, Tanzania, Mary Leakey's team found them in 78. Just a miracle. There was an ash fall 3.5 million years ago. 2 creatures went walking by, a large one and a small one. We assume it was a male and a female, and ash covered over it. Then it was found in 1978. Again, just a miracle, and here you go. And we've got good, clear images of the footprint of the creature walking 3.5 million years ago. So we assume that that creature that you saw must have started prior to that in order to be walking this efficiently upright at 3.5 million years ago. So the theory became, well, humans and apes must have split from a common ancestor sometime between 5 and 8 million years ago. 5 and 8 million years ago for us to be walking upright well at 3.5. We had to be walking decently upright at 4 million years ago. So it's just pretty much randomly pulling it out of the hat. Now we have creatures that may be upright as far back as 6 million years ago, but there's debate and it's not proved yet. But at least 3.5 for sure, here we are. But it's not really a human track. Next slide. And that's understandable, because you're looking at 3.5 million years of, quote, evolution between these two. So you have quite a different look. This is a photogrammetric analysis, meaning it studies the pressure points in the footprints at Laetoli and in a human footprint. Now look at how we walk. We have a good hard slam on the heel, what's called a heel strike. We have our momentum shift over here. This is our ankle point, which is to the rear of our foot, back near our heel. And we swing our momentum around our arch, assuming we have normal feet, and then it goes over to here, it gathers in the ball under our big toe, and we thrust off of our big toe, and we use our other toes for balancers, and then we thrust off. Now this one, on the other hand, does it completely different. It's got an ankle that's centered up, middle of the foot. It's got a heel strike and a forefoot strike that are dead equal. It comes down flat on its feet, very smooth. And instead of toeing off the way we do, it toes off with the ball area of its foot. And in every way, this is actually a better stride. This is a better walk. Because what's happening with us is we're going from our heel strike, we're swinging our momentum around our arch and cutting it over like this. That's creating torque in our joints that we don't need. And that torque in our joints wears us out over time. And when we get old, our joints wear out and we get arthritis and all all the things humans are subject to. So you're looking at a better, more efficient way to walk at 3.5 million years ago than us. That's pretty strange, isn't it? Now, what could be walking better than us at 3.5 million years ago? Next slide. Lucy. You all know Lucy. Afar Valley, Ethiopia, 1974, found by Donald Johanson. And here you go. She's upright. There's no doubt about it. 3.2 million years ago. And the assumption is that her kind made those tracks at Laetoli, and it's a fair assumption. I would agree with that. But what I want you to notice about Lucy is that she's about 3'6" to 3'8" tall. About 3 feet 6 to 3'8" tall. Now, notice how robust her bones are relative to humans. If that was a human being standing there that was the same size, 3'6" to 3'8", her arm bone would be the size of this, the forearm bone, rather than this. So Lucy, as all primates are as much, much stronger and has much more robust bones than we do, and a longer upper arm bone. It would be, the human one would be off about right here somewhere. Longer in the arms. Okay, next slide. Lucy's group is the Australopithecines. She's Afarensis, there's Africanus, there's Robustus, and Boise. What you're looking at is basically the pre-human record from 4 million years ago approximately to 2 million years ago approximately. Now, like I said, there are some others that are recent discoveries that could go back as far as 6 million years, but for right now, this is the starting lineup of the Australopithecines. 2 upright walking chimps, 2 upright walking gorillas. 2 upright walking chimps, 2 upright walking gorillas. Now, doesn't it make sense to assume that they might have walked out of the Miocene on those 2 feet? Since they're basically primates, they're chimps and gorillas. They're primates. Ah, but no, it couldn't be because they walk upright. So they have to be pre-humans, which is part of the brainwashing to get everybody to believe that somehow humans are coming out of this dark past that nobody quite seems to understand. Next slide. What you have at 2 million years ago to the present is a transformation here. You go from those chimps and gorillas to something that really does look more man-like. So it's called early Homo. Homo habilis, Homo erectus, Homo archaic, and Neanderthal skullcap. And then us, Cro-Magnon, right here, 120,000 years ago in the fossil record. So we've gone from 4 million years, suddenly some kind of transformation here at the 2 million year mark. And then you have this kind of microevolution in which you get changes in the configurations and some increase in the brains. But basically, they stay the same. They stay the same as they were when they were Australopithecines and got rearranged. They have thick bones, which all of the Australopithecines had, much thicker than ours. They have these thick, heavy brow ridges. They have big, round, night vision eyes. They have wide nasal passages. And they have mouths that stick off their face, both in the upper jaw, maxilla, and the lower jaw. And the lower jaws have no chins. The chins just drop off. With this, you have a completely different reconfiguration. You have a great thinning of the bone, a lightening of the bone. You have great reduction in the brow ridges. You have a forehead. I forgot to mention they don't have foreheads. They just slope back from the brows, but it's hard to see from a front-on view, but they have no forehead. So we have a forehead. We have greatly reduced brow ridges. We have eye sockets that are greatly reduced relative to these and poor night vision. We have little pinched up noses that stick off our face. We have mouths that are squashed in flat. And we have chins that stick out. Exactly the opposite. In every dimension you could ask for, we are completely different than them. And yet, we're told that's a transition just coming right on through here. No big jumps, no transformations anywhere. When indeed, it's obvious to a child that you have a huge transformation here, you have a huge transformation there. Unacknowledged. Okay, next slide. All right, this is an example of the early homos, early man. This is a Homo erectus boy called the Lake Turkana boy, found about 1.5 million years ago he died. And notice, if you will, how incredibly well put together. This is, by the way, the most complete early hominid that we have. And he stood about 5'8" at the age of 12. He's called the Lake Turkana boy because he was a boy. His molars had not erupted, so he's considered to be about 12. He's 5'8". He's going to grow to 6'2", 6'6", whatever when he's going to be big. He's going to be big, and is he going to be strong? Every one of his bones are so robust and thick compared to ours. Every one of his bones at 12 years old is bigger and stronger than any bone in Arnold Schwarzenegger's body. This is a powerful kid. Now, what's that all about? What's Lucy's big bones all about? What's his big bones all about? It's the amount of strength that their muscles can generate. The thickness of your bones is a function of the power that your muscles can generate, the torque they can apply to the bones. What's the point of having bones that are going to snap under the strain that your muscles can create for you? Now, also understand that is nothing but a primate body and primate strength. Primates are 5 to 10 times stronger than we are pound for pound. Any primate. Anybody that's had a pet monkey knows what I'm talking about, how incredibly strong they are for those skinny little arms they have. That is primate strength. These are primate bones. Furthermore, notice he has that incredible extra length in his arm, and you really see it here. Some of Lucy's was chewed off, and you don't see a good placement of hers. But here you see it, and what it means is his fingertips dangle down around his knees. And that's the story with all so-called pre-humans. Their arms are too long. Their arms are dangling down around their knees. Their arms are the arms of the Miocene apes. They're about the same size as their legs. Essentially, nothing has changed for like 20 million years in their bodies. You with me? Okay, next slide. All right, same thing with the Neanderthals. And this was supposed to be our kissing cousins up until just recently when it was proven that genetically we don't have anything to do with them. But up until then, these were our kissing cousins. And look at the difference. A fingertip of a Neanderthal and a human, a thigh bone of a Neanderthal and a human. Look at the thickness of the power of the muscle strength that this thing could generate in order to have a bone like that. There's no comparison. How could anybody look at this and think that there's some kind of a link between the two? And now we know that there's not. This is a primate, again, just an upright walking primate through the Neanderthals. We're something different. Next slide. So what we see from this diagram of early humans coming into the humans is the differences. You see that as you see, the arms dangle down around the knees in every case relative to ours. You have these upside down triangle rib cages relative to our nice oval. This is all very primate. Bones are very thick relative to ours. And the heads have the same things that we saw earlier, the lack of a forehead, big round night vision eyes, big wide noses, nasal passages, and mouths that stick off their face, and lacking chins that's sloping back. It's hard to tell. But also, too, you see the extra length in the neck. Their heads are kind of tucked down in their bodies like this. They are not built the way we are. They're built like primates. See, chimp heads and gorilla heads. All of them have primate bodies. The only thing is they're walking upright. So science has to call them pre-human because they can't call them post-Miocene apes. They have to connect them with humanity. Why? Because it doesn't leave us any place on the flowchart of life on Earth if they don't. So they're desperate to always link any pre-human to humans. And there's really no fair link to make. Next slide. Okay, so what are we looking at here? We're looking at a lie. We're looking at a lie, basically. That the lie is that this is a transition that's very smooth and it leads to us. Well, the truth of it is there's not a single human bone in the so-called pre-human fossil record. Not a single human bone in the pre-human fossil record. And if you really pin down anthropologists, you know what? They'll agree with that. They have no choice. An idiot can see it. What they will say is, yes, it's true. It's true. That's why we call them pre-humans. They're not quite humans. But we're going to find the missing link that's going to stand in here between these two, and suddenly it's all going to make sense. When in reality, you need a half a dozen or maybe a dozen to logically, in the Darwinian way, move from this to this. One missing link is not going to do it. But more than that, they have been looking their fannies off for 140 years and they don't have a finger bone of the missing link. There is no missing link. Never been a missing link, never going to be a missing link. It's just a fraud that they perpetrate on you and everybody out there because they want you to buy into their agenda. And they want you to not buy into the creationist agenda. And frankly, I don't want you to buy into the creationist agenda either. I just want you to open up your minds and start exploring the middle ground, because there is an answer in the middle ground.
Now let's talk for a minute about what happened to these creatures. We're told that they all went extinct, and that those that didn't want to go extinct, we killed them all. Now, is that possible? Yes, it is. We are pack animals. We are wolves with spears. We could kill them, and we did kill them.
We did some serious killing of those folks, but we didn't kill them all. We couldn't kill them all. They were everywhere. It was their planet. They'd been here since the Miocene, 20 million years, every nook and cranny. We couldn't kill them all. But we killed enough of them for the survivors to get the idea that we got to go where these cats don't move. And that would be the thick forests and jungles of the world. The thick forests and jungles of the world where we don't live. We think we do. We think we live everywhere. We think we're masters of all we survey. The truth is, we do not survey all we claim to be masters of. I don't know the situation here in England, but I can tell you for sure that in the United States, fully 25% of the United States, 25%, has never once been foot surveyed. Why? Can't get in there and do it. Too thick, too hard, too difficult. That's where these other creatures could have gone. Very easily could have gone. And if they did, they would stop making fossils. It's obvious that they lived in the areas, in the prime areas of the earth, because that's where you make fossils. Now, making a fossil is a very hard thing to do. You have to die at the water hole, you have to be killed, and then before the predator that kills you at the water hole can consume you, a herd of something like water buffalo or wildebeest or whatever comes along, scares the predator off, and stomps your body down into the mud. And then you will rot, and then your minerals will seep into your bones, and you'll turn into a fossil. Or you can be caught in a flash flood and be rolled up in a wad of mud, and the same thing happens. It's very, very rare circumstances that are going to make a fossil. Understand that. Generally, when you die, you're totally consumed by scavengers, and your bones are consumed by bacteria and molds in a matter of a few weeks to a few months. If Mother Nature did not clean her plate completely, we would step out of this hall and be looking at 1,000 feet high piles of bones all around us. So understand that. Making fossils is rare. Making fossils in deep forests and jungles doesn't happen. Why? Because you don't die at the water hole. You're getting all the material that you need, all the liquid you need from the environment around you. When you die in a jungle or a deep forest, you are consumed. Mother Nature does clean her plate. There's no way for you to be fossilized. Most people are not aware of it, but to this day there is not a single fossilized bone of a chimpanzee. And that we know they've been here for millions of years. Not a single fossilized bone of a chimpanzee. And the few that we have of other primates are very debatable that live in those environments. So if these creatures went into the deep forests and jungles, which I contend that they did, some of them, then they could still be with us today. And if that's true, then it would explain the stories from around the world, every continent except Antarctica, of what? Tall, big, robust, upright walking, hair-covered, primate-looking creatures. Right? You get that from all over the world, but right now everybody thinks that's just a farce because science really puts it out hard that that's a joke, impossible, all that. And I would venture to say that everybody that came in here tonight probably thought that, unless they've read my book or know about what I do. It's not true. Now, next slide. This is a hominoid. A hominoid. And that is what those creatures are, the ones that everybody says they see around the world. These upright walking, hair-covered, primate-looking creatures. This is the Bigfoot kind. This guy's about 5'8", so you get an idea of how tall they are. But the Bigfoot type, there are 4 types. Bigfoot Sasquatch type, same name, same creature, different name, is about 7 to 10 feet tall, weighs about 700 to 1,000 pounds. The abominable snowman Yeti kind, which you also know about from the Himalayas and seems to be restricted to the Himalayas, which taken together is about the size of the United States, they are about 5 to 7 feet tall, weigh about 400 to 700 pounds, and they are, quote, man-sized. Now there's another man-sized, but they're much heavier and more robust than humans, but another man-sized kind is called almas. Now, almas dominate in the mountains of southern Russia and western China, but they're also, again, on every continent except Antarctica. The last kind is a dwarf kind, a pygmy kind, called the agagwes. They're about 4 feet tall, weigh about 200 pounds, and they live in the jungles of the world around the equator of Africa and in Indonesia and places like that, around the equator, in the jungles. Now, the others live in what are called montane forests. The almas and the Bigfoot kind live in lower montane forests. The abominable snowman Yeti kind live in upper montane forests, but in any case, montane forests are very, very dense, thick hardwood forests, 4 tiers sometimes. Very, very difficult for human beings to make their way through, and basically we don't. It's just too hard. Now, we may skirt the edges, go hunting in them a little bit, but we don't live in the heart of them, and that's where they live. They have plenty of room, plenty of room. You will be surprised to learn, and I just found this out not too long ago. I used to think that the earth was split up into about 45% wilderness and 55%, but they've done a recent recount, and they think it's still more like 50-50. Of the arable land of the earth, about 50% of it is still wild wilderness. So there is plenty of room for them to share the planet with us, and rarely, if ever, cross our paths. And they don't. Rarely, rarely. Only about 150 times a year do we get good reports of sightings around the world. But 150 is a lot, and it piles up over time. And over time, we have collected a huge amount of evidence for their reality. And we'll talk about that. The first thing they do is, in terms of proof, is we look at prints, because these things are big, they're heavy, and they leave tracks. And over the past 50 years, we have photographed or plaster casted or both about 10,000 of these tracks. It's a lot of tracks. According to science, every single one of them is faked. Now, is that possible? Possible to fake that tracks that easily? Let's take a look. We know a lot about tracks. Next slide. There is a science called ichnology, and the ichnologists study tracks that are left in fossils, and they can tell you an enormous amount about any animal that left a track in a fossil. When we are in primitive societies, what's the one thing we have to teach our progeny above all else? How to read the tracks in the area, so they can learn to feed their families, and so they can also learn not to feed the family of some wild predator. We know about tracks. And one of the basic lessons is this. When you take a fleshy foot like a human foot or a hominoid foot, the combination of 26 bones, 33 joints, and dozens of muscles and ligaments and tendons makes a very smooth and sequential print as it goes down on a suitable medium. It starts in the middle and kind of pushes out gradually as everything sequentially moves into place. And so it leaves things here on the inside, very fine little lines called compression lines. And they're really unmistakable. Now, next slide. If you have a fake foot, whether that be wood or plaster or plastic or rubber or anything, you don't have any flexibility in it at all. They don't have articulating fake feet. They don't have. It's too fine. It can't possibly do it. So it has to go down of a piece. It has to be stamped or pressed or whatever into the medium, and that gives a completely different look. It gives you impact ridges that are cracked along the top and the outside. Now, I can give this little lesson to a group of third graders and lay some prints out, some fake, some real, and you give them a magnifying glass, they won't miss one. It's that easy. That easy. And yet, all 10,000 of those tracks that we have that we think are genuine have to be fake. Not because they really are fake, but because they simply have to be fake because these creatures cannot be real. Because if these creatures are real, then humans have no place in the flowchart of life on Earth, because it will take those same third graders to make the connection that, oh, these things look like the pre-humans. Where are the humans? Where did the humans fit in? And that's what science, our religion, doesn't want to deal with. Next slide. Okay, this is a human foot again, and you saw it with the Laetoli print, but I just want to put it back in your mind. This is how we walk. Heavy heel strike, swinging the momentum up around the arch, over into the ball of the foot, thrusting out of the big toe and the other toes. You remember that picture. Just keep it in mind. Next shot. Now we're going to look at a Bigfoot track. Okay, now look at the difference. We have this extended heel backwards. We have the ankle right here in the middle, middled up, just like in the Laetoli track, if you recall. We have the forefoot shortened and widened greatly. We have the toes sort of the same shape and acting in concert rather than the way ours works with the big toe. These are all working together, and the thrust-off point, if there is one, is right here. Notice, though, how smoothly the whole foot goes down, just like the Laetoli track, heel and ball hitting at the same time. And notice, too, if you would, the line of motion is right straight. It's just straight. This is as efficient and as good a walk as the Laetoli creature had. Much better than ours. No torque through the joints here. No heel strike, no toe off. Nice smooth lay down, nice smooth lay down. Walking better than we do. All right, next slide. Here we see another comparison of a human foot and a Bigfoot foot, just to again give you a sense of how incredibly different they are. Next slide. Now here's another pair of hominoid tracks. And notice these were found together, so again we assume, just like with Laetoli, it's a male and a female. But in every other way, it's just like the other ones that you saw. It's clearly a hominoid track, is it not? I mean, it looks just like the others. Furthermore, this one looks exactly like the one from Laetoli 3.5 million years ago. I mean, keep this toe image in your mind. 3.5 million years ago, Laetoli, and it's all the same, clearly hominoid, but guess what it is? Neanderthal. Neanderthal tracks taken out of a cave in Toriano, Italy, 30,000 years ago, out of the clay in the floor of the cave, and that's why it looks so gunky like this, because it was taken out of clay. But these are, without any question, Neanderthal tracks, Neanderthal artifacts found all around it. Nobody calls this anything but Neanderthal. And it's clearly, not only is it clearly hominoid, this one again goes all the way back to Laetoli. Next slide. Let's look and see. See? Same thing. No change. 3.5 million years to 30,000 years ago. The hominoids are the pre-humans. And they go back to the Miocene. There really is no place for humans in the flowchart of life on Earth. There really isn't. And the facts are there. But more importantly, if you doubt the track, if you think somehow I'm shaving it with the track, check this. The thing we do have to prove it is the feet of Neanderthal. We have no other whole feet of any pre-humans, but we do have the feet of a Neanderthal. Next slide. Check this out. Neanderthal, human, Neanderthal. Look at the difference. Now this is the same bones. It's just like the skulls. It's the same bones, but reconfigured and reconstituted into a completely different functioning outfit. Look at this little nub of a heel we have compared to this. Look at this little bump of an ankle bone we have compared to this big thing, and it's forward and centered. Now notice too that their foot is swinging out around all of that. So it's got a much thicker, heavier, padded foot than we have. It's a foot designed to be out in nature, unshod for a lifetime, compared to our little foot, which is not built that way. Look at the difference in our big toe and our little toes. Look at the comparison here, how similar they are to each other. They're working together. Look at the width of the forefoot. Look at how ours is stretched out and pinched off. You can see the bow in our foot, the bend. We're off balance. You can see it. Whereas look at this guy, how solid that's put together. This is better than this. If we had it to do over, we need a redesign in the feet. We need a redesign in a bunch of places, but starting with our feet. I don't know about you, but I find this fascinating for me. The panda, oh yes, of course, great story. Hominoids. What we say to ourselves is, why don't we go out and get one? If they're out there the way I'm saying they are, why don't we go out and get one? Should be easy, they should be out there. The panda was the hominoid of the 1800s. Scientists would get these rumors of a black and white bear that ate bamboo coming out of China, and they said, forget about it. Bears are carnivores, and that's that. Can't possibly be true. And then in 1869, one was captured and killed. And so they knew they were real. So starting in 1870, every zoo and museum in the world that was big and had money sent teams into Sichuan province, China, which is about, I guess, the size of France, into the bamboo forests of the mountainous, rugged terrain to get the next panda. Now, how long would you think that took them? I mean, this is back when people really knew how to make their way in the woods. How long do you think to get the next panda? 60 years. 60 years. Now, it sounds like an exaggeration, a gross exaggeration, and it is. They really only looked about 30 years, and they said, well, they must be extinct now. And then 30 years later, Teddy Roosevelt's sons, our President Teddy Roosevelt's sons, were in there doing some hunting, and they killed one. So then over the next 20 years, they pulled out about a half a dozen and created the panda craze that we know. To this day, it's extremely difficult to go into the bamboo forests of Sichuan and pull out a wild panda. Now, why is that? What do they do? How clever are they? Well, really, they're not. They're big, as you see. You know what a panda looks like. They're black and white. They're very much stand out against the green background that they live in. They're very slow-moving. They eat a very restricted diet. They live in the daytime. They're stupid as a bag of hammers. Anybody could sneak up on one if they were within the neighborhood. The problem is with us. We can't make it where they live. Again, we think we can just go anywhere we want. We can't. We can't. There are whole vast stretches of earth we never go into that have never had a human foot on them. But we don't like to accept that because we like to just think that we're masters of everything. The panda shows that there's plenty of room for creatures that are big, fast, mobile, live mostly at night, eat anything, and in their environment will hear better than us, see better than us, smell better than us, and no doubt in their environment think better than us. We're not just going to mount up and go get one. We're going to see them only by accident, and that's how it happens. But it does happen, and it has happened. Let's go over just some of the best evidence real quick. Next slide. I'm not going to go into the detail of these stories. It's all in my book. I urge you to get the book if you can. It's really a good book. I think one of the best in the field, and it sounds egotistical to say that, but I think you'll really be pleased with it if you do get it. But it will cover all these issues that I'm going to go over quickly in thorough detail. This is a famous Patterson film. You've all seen this. Science goes so far over backwards to try to discredit this film, but in actuality, she walks the way she should walk to have that footprint that she laid down. Her arms, you can see looking at them, they're much longer than a human's arms, especially from the shoulder to the elbow. Her breasts sway perfectly the way living flesh would move. In 1967, it would have been impossible to create that. This is a real, true story. Again, you can read about it. Was not a fake. Next slide. This is the famous Minnesota Iceman, another killed hominoid. Shot it in the back, blew this nice big hole in its chest. The guy that killed it threw it in a 7-foot ice freezer and drove it around to fairs and malls in the States from the late 60s to about 1980. I saw it as a young man several times, and I can tell you for sure this was the real deal. Again, science goes to great lengths to try to discredit this, but the reality of it is if you read in my book, this was absolutely 100% genuine. Next slide. Now, this is a guy named Albert Ostman talking to a reporter here. This guy, as a young man, was captured by a family of big feet, and they generally, hominoids do live in groups, family groups, and sometimes a little larger groups, but mostly family groups. It was a male, a female, and 2 juvenile offspring. And they held him captive for 6 days before he escaped. He didn't tell his story for 33 years. But when he did, as an old man, He heard that finally that somebody else had seen one of these things, and he came out of the woodwork and told his story. Great detail. He was grilled by the best. He took several lie detector tests, and nobody denies that this guy was telling the truth, and he knew details about them that nobody else did. Another true story, a fascinating full story done up in my book. Next slide. This is Zana, perhaps the most interesting one of all. Zana was from Russia. She was an Alma, living Neanderthal. The Almas are living Neanderthals. Now, she was captured in 1850 and taken to a village called Takina, and she lived there for 40 years. In the 1960s, Russian Bigfoot experts began, and they take it, by the way, Russia and China, much more serious than we do. They know. They've had hundreds of years of stories about them, so they know they're real, and they do very serious research on it. And they did very serious research on her case, and what they found was that she died in 1890. So as they were doing the research in the mid-1960s, there were still over 100 people alive in the area where she lived that had known her when they were young. And so they were able to get tremendous corroborative details about her and her children. Because she was a slave of the village to do the grunt work. She was so strong, make her do the fetching of the wood and fetching of the water and siphoning the hay and carrying the hay. And she was just the village slave. But she was also the village sex object for the men. And so she ended up giving birth to 8 living Alma human hybrids, 4 of which lived to maturity to become Russian citizens. All of whom could do the one thing she couldn't do, which was talk. They didn't really they looked like her, but they weren't covered with hair the way she was. Their skin was darker. They were ugly enough to make freight trains take dirt roads, but they could talk. So they were able to integrate into the community, have children. Her grandchildren and great-grandchildren are alive in Russia today. And yet, you never see anything about this. But the researcher, she had died in 1890, and there were a few people still left who were at her funeral. They knew where she was buried, but it's a Muslim area, and so they didn't mark the grave. So they couldn't just bulldoze the whole cemetery to try to get to her bones. But her youngest son, Kvit, had died in 1954, and they knew right where he was, so they let his body be exhumed. Now, remember, I believe that the Almas are living Neanderthals. Now, check Kvit's skull. Next slide. Isn't that Neanderthal looking? You have an occipital bun back here. You have virtually no forehead or very little forehead. Huge brow ridges. Big round night vision eyes. Big round nose. Huge jaw, but the chin that allowed him to speak. Look at the size of this guy. You want to meet him in a dark alley? Now, what they say, what anthropologists say is, he's just an extreme variation of the human norm. Real extreme. This is basically a Neanderthal. If I'm right about all this, and I think that I am, then it means that, again, humans have no place. We weren't here. We didn't evolve here. We didn't develop here. So it can only mean one thing. We came here. We're put here. We're new here. How do we explain that? Okay? Next slide. Now, Sumer, modern-day Iraq, this was the beginning of culture as we know it in the Tigris-Euphrates Valley, the Sumerians. And these people walk out of the Stone Age about 6,000 years ago, and suddenly they just create these, boom, full-blown, very sophisticated culture right out of the Stone Age. It makes no sense, and it never has. And so what do historians do? They don't talk about them very much. They make it seem like history began with the Egyptians, the Greeks, and the Romans. But in reality, Egyptians, Greeks, and Romans took a lot of what they had from the Sumerians, who dominated for almost 2,000 years. Nice, strong cultural run. We don't talk a lot about them. But nonetheless, next slide, they had and produced over 100 of the firsts that we attribute to a high civilization. They had the first cities, well-organized cities, the first high-rise buildings, the ziggurats, the first government, the first religion, they had running water, the 2 tracks of water that we're always amazed. But they were geniuses with water. They had the first wheeled vehicles, the first widespread trade, the first ocean-going vessels. I mean, you can't name a first they didn't have. Well, cable TV, they didn't have that. But the point is, they come from nowhere with all of this. How did it happen? It can't be explained. And so again, they're left off. And all we really hear about the Sumerians is what? They invented writing. It's like they appear, boop, and writing, boop, and go away. And that's it. Next slide. There's their writing. It's called cuneiform. It can't be denied because there's so many of them. There's so many of these tablets left. Because why? They were done onto clay and fired in a kiln, another Sumerian first, a very sophisticated device for baking things, kiln, and they were turned into stone. So the old-fashioned, the old term, biblical term, written in stone, here's where it comes from, written in stone. Anyway, 100,000 of these tablets or more, most of which are like these little palm things that fit in your hand, and they're just bills of sale, they're business. But these larger ones, and there's about 5,000 of these, tell stories. Tell what the Sumerians were putting forth as their history. But because their history doesn't jibe with the modern paradigm, it's just considered myth, and it's just put aside, and it's not dealt with. But they have some amazing things to say in these stories. They really do. And it's not myth. Because why? Who gives the first culture myth? Who hands it down to them? There's nobody back there to hand them a myth. It's got to be history. Got to be. Next slide. Here's something else they would create. Instead of those tablets, they would create what are called cylinder seals. We've got, again, thousands of these. And when they had the writing, that was when they wanted an individual to read something or to put it in the libraries. They had libraries, by the way. They had schools. They had higher education. They had advanced teaching. They were amazing. So the stone tablets are found in their libraries. They had libraries. But when they had something that they wanted to get out to the people, to get out to everybody, this was their printing press, basically. They would roll it off onto clay, and they would make copies of it. They would make a cylinder seal out of stone, generally very hard stone, so that they could make as many copies as they wanted. And everybody would know what these things were symbolized on the cylinder seal. You know how that cartoon that I showed you earlier, Eat, Survive, Reproduce, what's it all about? We all understood that. We all understood the larger picture of what that meant. Same thing here. These are like cartoons. Everybody would have understood what this story was, the gods giving the water to the water buffalo or whatever. But the point here is this. These things average 2 to 3 inches tall. They're the size of good-sized spools of thread. And these things, this incredible detail is somehow incised into these hard stones. Now look at this. What they say is seal makers apparently drilled details into the stone, then refined them with abrasives. Now, you read things like this all the time in historical texts. You read them all the time, and you read it and you say, oh, yeah, okay, well, did abrasives, and you just buy it. You just accept it because you don't expect them to be lying to you to support an agenda. But the reality of it is, these are so small, there's not a grain of sand, there's not an abrasive you can name that would fit in there. Lasers would have a hard time cutting it because that's less than a square inch. And they've got thousands of them with that kind of detail. How would they do that? Nobody knows. It's just a throw up your hands and God only knows. Must have been abrasives. Ridiculous. Ridiculous. Next slide. Okay, this is another one. Now this one they did a lot because you can tell how worn down it is. And this is called the granting of the plow. You have a seated god, you have a standing god. And we know they're gods because the gods wore horned headgear most of the time. And then you have a human. And the human's carrying a digging stick, and the god is giving him the standard primitive plow that you can see right now in Egypt or India or anywhere. But I think this is pretty cool because you're talking, 4,000 years ago, 2000 BC, 2500 BC, and you're seeing that they were accepting that the gods gave them civilization, gave them culture, gave them the plow, gave them agriculture. The gods gave them everything according to the Sumerians. But also notice this, between the second god and the human. Isn't that cool? What is this? Does that look like anything you recognize? Next slide. Solar system. Mercury, Venus, Earth, Moon, Mars, should be the asteroid belt there, Jupiter, Saturn, Pluto as a moon of Saturn, Uranus, Neptune. What the Sumerians said is that Pluto started as a moon of Saturn, and because it's sitting out there where it is, 17 degrees off the ecliptic, we know it didn't form with the rest of the planets. It had to be put out there some kind of way, and the Sumerians do have a story for how that happened. I talk about it in my book, don't have time for it now. But the key to this is they felt there was another planet in our solar system which they called Nibiru. And that Nibiru was captured by our solar system as the solar system was forming pretty much. And instead of going in counterclockwise circles like the rest of the planets, it was captured like a comet, and it moves in a clockwise orbit about 3,600 years long. Clockwise orbit, 3,600 years long. And that on this planet Nibiru live a race of beings called the Anunnaki. Again, this is the Sumerians talking in their tablets. And the Anunnaki, they say, came to Earth, lived on Earth, and at a point in time of their stay here, they decided that they needed a slave and a servant. And they determined to build that slave and that servant in their own image, after their own likeness, which it says in the tablets, which echoes all the way down to the Bible. We shall build the Adamu. They call their slave and servant the Adamu. We shall build the Adamu in our own image, after our own likeness, to give the gods their ease. And we shall create animals of the field and plants of the field to give the gods their ease. Domesticated plants and animals. If any of you want to read my thoughts on that, you can read some of my articles in Nexus magazine and in my book. Fascinating stuff. Fascinating stuff. If you look at the solar system like this, this is more evidence of what the Sumerians say about the Anunnaki, because guess what? The Sumerians called Earth not the third rock from the sun. Not the third rock from the sun. Guess what? The seventh planet, they called it. They count correctly Pluto on in. And more than that, guess what else they say in one of their tablets? They say that if you look at Uranus and Neptune in the heavens, they look like blue-green watery twins. Blue-green watery twins. And our own astronomers didn't figure this out or didn't know this until Voyager went out in the late 80s, when Voyager went out and determined it. Until then, everybody thought those were cold, dead rocks. Nobody would have accepted the blue-green watery twins until they went out there and saw it for themselves. And yet there are the Sumerians writing about it 4,000 years ago. And more importantly, and you saw it on the cylinder seal, what are they doing even knowing that Pluto, Uranus, and Neptune are out there? When you can't see them, we didn't know they were there until the last 300 years. What are the Sumerians doing knowing this information they absolutely should not have? They admit it very freely. We got it from the Anunnaki. The Anunnaki made us. The Anunnaki told us everything. They are our gods. We serve them. Is it possible? Is it possible that there were superior beings on the earth in the deep past living here and at some point creating us as their slaves and servants? Well, there's certainly evidence that they were here, and it's all around us. Next slide. You got some of it here in the neighborhood. Megalithic stones from anywhere in the world. These are only 50 tons. These are pretty light. But you will notice that science focuses on one thing when they try to discuss megalithic stones and how they might come to be. How did the primitive people move them there? How did they set them up? How did they move them there? And that is not the issue. They do that to get you to look away from the real issue, which is, how did they cut them out? How did they cut them out? Not how did they... Moving them's hard enough, but cutting them out is impossible. Because why? We can't do it today. Next slide. This is the classic. This is an ancient 1,170, what you were just looking at was 50, 1,170 ton obelisk lies unfinished at the Aswan Quarry. A crack rendered the stone unusable. Now, this thing's about, what, 130 feet long, about 40, 50 feet wide, whatever, 30 feet, it doesn't matter. It's huge. You ever been there? You ever seen it? Anybody? It sits in a hole about 15 feet deep. This is it. The guy taking the pictures, it's in a hole. It's got just those little edges where they worked it, but they've got it pretty much done. They're working on the spire here. This is the mark of a machine. Now, what they say is that this is, of course, done with stone. That Stonehenge was done with stone. Everything was cut with stone. This is pink granite. One of the hardest stones in the world. Those blue stones at Stonehenge, aren't they the hardest stones in the world? How do you cut stone on stone when you're working with some of the hardest stones there are. And you polish them to a high sheen. Look at some of the obelisks that they finished. How big and beautiful they are. How were they doing that? What abrasives were they using on those? It's incredible. So they're working on this one, and this is not a little stone axe chopping it out. This is some kind of the equivalent of a big belt sander taking out chunks of pink granite the size of the seat that you're sitting on. And they were pressing right here with the belt sander, taking this out, shaping the point, and oh, they pressed too hard and they cracked it. And they unbuckled that machine and they just went away and they left it for us to marvel at. But now, let's think about it a minute. What's the real problem here? It's not cutting it here and shaping it. It's that final cut through the bottom to get it up. How could they do that? We could not today, we do not have a saw blade today that could pass through that, under that, because the weight of the stone would absolutely freeze it as soon as it got up under it. It could not be done. Impossible. So no primitive people, but it's just like saying somehow they did it with abrasives. Somehow they did it. Somehow. They didn't do it. That's the key. They didn't do it. The gods did this. The Anunnaki did this. No other way. All right? Now, let's talk for a minute about the possibility that they created us. If the Sumerians are correct about that they were at least here, and clearly leaving their fingerprint all over the place with these megalithic stones, some of which are much bigger than this. You got 2,000 tonners in Baalbek and Tiwanaku. So then it stands to reason that they could be right about them creating us. Does it not? Let's look at that possibility. Next slide. We found in the late 1980s that we could look at our mitochondrial DNA of our females and determine where we originated in time as a species, because the mitochondria mutates at a certain rate. So geneticists said at the time, well, let's take the mitochondrial DNA of a large example of women around the world and see if humans began to split from that ape ancestor closer to 8 million years ago or closer to 5 million years ago, which was the gospel among scientists when this project got underway. And the mitochondria, you need to understand, is not in the nucleus. And this relates to the Starchild because we're looking at the same thing, but it's outside the nucleus. And so it only passes down through females because sperm are too small to pass it on. So your mitochondria goes down through females. So we said, okay, we'll look at the female mitochondria and we'll see if it's closer to 8 million years, closer to 5 million years. When the answer came in, everybody was flabbergasted. Because it's not 8 million years, not 5 million years. It's only about 200,000 years. 200,000 years beyond that, we don't seem to exist as a species.
Now, not only did this work indicate how old the oldest humans were, they indicated where they came from. They said they came from southern Africa.
And guess what? When this work came in, next slide please, guess what? The oldest women were from southern Africa. And boy, do you think Newsweek had to swallow hard before they put this cover on to go down into the deep south in my part of the country of the United States. To say Adam and Eve were black, are you kidding me? In the south? So they made them look as white as they possibly could, which of course annoyed the heck out of the blacks. So in trying to have it both ways, Newsweek caught it coming and going, but they told the truth because it's clear. The oldest female humans come from southern Africa, just where the Sumerians claim we started. Pretty odd coincidence, isn't it? Next slide. Okay, now what are the odds again of us being created? Well, something certainly happened here. The cerebral cortex is the deeply convoluted surface region of the brain that is most strongly linked to intelligence. It's that staining on the outside. You peel that off of a rat, it'll cover a postage stamp. Peel it off a monkey, it'll cover a postcard. Peel it off a chimpanzee, a sheet of typing paper. Peel it off of us, 4 sheets of typing paper. Something clearly happened here. This is not a transition of any kind. This is a transformation. More than that, we only use maybe a half sheet, maybe a sheet of what we have. These guys use all theirs, but we're different. We have a completely different wiring system. And we only use a part of it. Now, you get a lot of argument about this now because nobody wants to really deal with this from the scientific end of things. But the truth of it is, there's been enough research done on savants. Used to be called idiot savants. They're called savants now. You all remember Dustin Hoffman and Rain Man. There are over 100 of those folks. And each of them, in the damage to their good part, whether that's 10% or 20% or whatever it is, the damage to the good part, they get a ray of light, like this beam here, into some other part of the shut-off part in our brains. Why? Because the Anunnaki would not have made their slave and their servant be anywhere near as smart as them. But they had to give us their bodies. We shall make the Adam who in our own image after our own likeness. They had to give us their bodies, including their brains. But they had to do something to shut it off so we would not be as smart as them. So they gave us only partial use, just enough to be smart enough so that they could tell us what they wanted us to do and depend on us to go off and do it, like good slaves and servants. But never to be smart enough to challenge them. And we know that, and we know their brains are in our heads and that their brains are super powerful relative to ours, because in savants they get these incredible abilities in math, in music, in art, in sculpture. Abilities that are so far beyond our normal geniuses, it's not even funny. So if there was only one of them, it would be a freak of nature. But you're looking at 100 and it's always the same thing. They get a little tear into, a little vision into what's blocked off in my brain and your brain and every normal person's brain. But if we could somehow drop that thing the Anunnaki put in, we could access all of this. And wouldn't we be something then? Wouldn't we be something then? Okay, next slide. Let's talk about how they did it. They did it with genetic engineering in the house of fashioning, according to the Sumerians. In the house of fashioning, where they created not us, but the domesticated plants and animals. And they go over the process, and it's very long and it's very detailed, and they make a lot of mistakes. It's not easy for them to make a sentient being. We'll work on fruit flies and we do okay. Try to make something like us, Dolly the clone, we saw all the trouble that they had with that. It's not that easy to make a real complex, complicated sentient being. Made a lot of mistakes, had a lot of false alarms, but they eventually did it. And they did it just the way we do it with genetic engineering. You use chemicals to cut in here and you can move this out, and you can move anything in and it will work. You can move plant into animal, animal into plant, fish into fowl. It does not matter because everything at this level is the same. Same 4 base pairs, same 20 amino acids. It's like Legos. It's like interchangeable. It's so amazing because it's as if it was designed this way to be easy for somebody who really knows what they're doing to just mix and match and make anything they want at any time they want. And when you go back and look at the history of life on Earth, when things just appear when they need to appear and the right stuff comes here, it's almost as if somebody's out there saying, okay, well, let's see what'll work here. There it is. It's just that easy. Isn't it amazing? It's as if it's just done on purpose. Okay, next slide. Okay, with us, as I said, they were making a lot of mistakes. But they were making a slave and they had a deadline. They had a revolt they were trying to quell and they had to get it done and they couldn't waste time. So they're making mistakes. Here you see our full complement of 46 chromosomes, 23 pairs. And here you see 28 of our major genetic deformities. We have, guess how many? Over 4,000 and counting genetic deformities. Now, does that make sense for a species only about 200,000 years old? No. Furthermore, if we descended from chimps and gorillas, they should have everything we've got, or pretty much. A lot of what we've got, and they don't. They have albinism and a few others, but not many. They have very few. All wild animals, all wild plants have very few genetic defects. Why? Because in the wild, what happens to a faulty copy? Get rid of it. Parents won't let it go. They will not let it get up to put their defect into the gene pool. But more importantly, several of these you're looking at here kill you dead before you can reach maturity. How would that get in the gene pool? How would that go from Eskimos to Watusis? The only way is if it was there at the very beginning of the species and it spread out as we multiplied in numbers. And the only way so many defects could get in there is mistakes in the cutting and splicing process as we were being assembled. It's the only way. And they didn't care. Because why? They're making a slave. What do they care if they kill 1 in 100? What if they care if they kill 1 in 10? As long as they got some coming out that work right. And they knew they would because they knew the numbers game here. Okay, next slide. Okay, this is really amazing to me. It is a comparison of human, chimpanzee, gorilla, and orangutan chromosomes. And you see how really similar they are. And you always hear about how similar we are. You know, 95%, 90% sharing the DNA and all. So it really makes it look like we descended from them. But they don't mention that we share about 50%. You'd be looking at a lot of similarity with a mouse up there. It's amazing. It's amazing how you can be fooled by these things. But let's talk for a minute about what the Anunnaki were up against when they wanted to create us. When they wanted to create a creature in their own image after their own likeness. And they said, well, okay, we're not really well adapted to Earth. And we know that because in the cylinder seals they're always shown, as you saw those gods, fully dressed, fully clothed, with things on their heads. And the humans are standing there, you know, maybe in loincloths or naked. The humans are better adapted to the planet than they are. So they said, okay, we're not really well adapted. Let's take some genes from the creatures of Earth. And they say that we shall take some of the creatures of Earth and use it as a model. So let's assume they use an almond like Xana. And so we've got some of her genes, but mostly we're going to have their genes where they want us to be like them. But they've got a problem, and it's a big one, because they themselves must have 46 chromosomes. Why? Because we, among primates, alone among primates, have 46 chromosomes. And so when they start with the Alma, they've got a creature with 48 chromosomes because all the primates on Earth have 48 chromosomes. So you got 48 chromosomes here, and you're the Anunnaki, and you got 46. How are you going to put this together? How are you going to make a living zygote to begin the process of manipulating? How are you going to do that? You've either got to do one of two things. With the sperm and the egg, you're going to be looking at a 24-23 mismatch in chromosomes. How are you going to make that? You're not. You've got to add a chromosome to the 23 or take away a chromosome from the 24, which would be the creature of Earth, or add a chromosome to your own self, neither of which will work because you won't have the same creature, and it's just too much DNA to fool with. You can't do it. There's only one way to solve this problem. You have to take the 48 chromosome, the one with the 48 chromosomes, and you have to fuse two of them together so that they only take up one space. And now you've got, even though you've got 48 chromosomes, it's taken up one space, and you can match it up with a 23, and you can get to work. Am I right? Do you understand me? Next slide. Look at our second one here with the orangutan. Second and third, gorilla second and third, chimp second and third, but human, uh-oh, somebody fused those two together. Now, we're told Mother Nature did that somehow, some way. You know, it's like everything else, it just happened by magic. The Anunnaki did this. There's no way otherwise for that to happen. And it's some of the clearest evidence that there is that we're genetically manipulated, genetically put together, and genetically created. And furthermore, we're told that we're like primates, that we're primates. When we don't have primate bones, we don't have primate muscles, we don't have primate skin, we don't have the primate hair pattern on our body. They're light in front, thick on back, we're light on back, thick on front. What's that about? We don't have their heads, their brains, their arm length. We don't have anything that's primate. We don't have primate sexuality, and we don't have the same number of chromosomes. How does that equal primate? It doesn't. Now, with all this said as background, we're going to talk solely about the Starchild and where the Starchild fits into all of this. What we're going to talk about now is the Starchild that you came here to see. I hope you're satisfied with the material that you didn't come here to see, but you're going to see how it ties in, I think, and with why I think the Starchild is as important as I do, and why I've gone to all the trouble that I have with it over these years in the face of tremendous apathy. I mean, apathy of unreal proportions when this thing is clearly special and unique. This is, of course, a similar shot to the one you saw earlier, except it's a little closer and a little darker because I wanted you to be able to see up close the surface of the bone. One of the things that's really turning out to be special about the Starchild is the bone is not the same really as human bone. Now, we knew that instantly from the first time I put my hands on it. I could feel the lightness, and I will, at the end of this, I will bring it to the back there, and those who want to stay and feel it and hold it, I'll give you an opportunity to do it, because this is an exact stereolithographic copy. It weighs the same, it looks the same, it's painted the same. You will see. But the story behind this I want to share with you now before I get into the details of what makes it unique, for those of you who don't know it, and probably not too many of you here do. In approximately 1930, she couldn't remember exactly when, but around 1930, a woman of Mexican extraction, she was about 15 at the time, was taken by her family to go visit the old home village. Her family earlier had snuck into the States and waited till they became legal and could then go out and come back freely, and she was an American citizen by then. She had been born there. So they went back when she was 15 to visit the old family homestead, the old village. And it was about, she said, 100 miles or so southwest from Chihuahua, Mexico, which is pushing off into the Copper Canyon area. If you know where that is, it's like Mexico's Grand Canyon. It's a very rugged area, very primitive, very rugged area. And there are caves and mines in the area, mine tunnels in the area, because it's a gold and silver area from back to the time of the Incas. So she was told upon landing there, do not go in the mines and caves around here, because that's taboo, that's verboten. We don't do that, and it's dangerous on top of that, so just don't do it. So needless to say, American teenager, tell them what not to do. She immediately snuck off as soon as she could and went into a mine tunnel where she says she saw a skeleton lying on its back. Being an intrepid young girl, she got up close enough to see that not only was it a skeleton lying on its back, but there was what she called a misshapen hand coming up out of the dirt beside it, and that misshapen hand was wrapped around the upper arm bone. When she saw that, she looked down and she could see that the dirt over that arm was coming up out of was loose. You know, in a mine tunnel, there's going to be no rain to impact the dirt, so it was as loose as the day it was put there 900 years earlier. We later found out that it was 900 years old. We carbon dated it. So it had been laying there for 900 years. So she dug out that loose dirt and she found what she called a smaller, misshapen body. And that's the only word we have, misshapen body, to go with the misshapen hand. Now, if you judge how misshapen the skull is, it was probably a fairly misshapen body, smaller. Now, the human one that we're looking at, and if you know native Mexicans from that area and that era, they're about 5 feet tall. They're much smaller than, you know, average people today. So if that was about a 5 foot tall woman, human, and we know it was a woman because we had a DNA test done on it, so it was a woman. If that woman was around 5 feet tall and this Starchild was substantially smaller, it was in the 4 foot range, we would imagine, or maybe a little less. But she ended up recovering the 2 skulls, minus the mandibles, and she brought them back to the States, snuck them in with her luggage, and snuck them in, and she knew she had done wrong. She knew she wasn't supposed to be doing this, so she didn't tell anybody. And she hid them and she kept them. And then she grew up and she got married and she lived her life, and she didn't really do anything with them. She just kept them in a cardboard box. And as she came to the end of her life, she willed them to an American couple, and they said, they'd take them, and they did, and they kept them in that same cardboard box in their garage for about 5 years. When the wife said, "I'm sick of those skulls being in the garage," and she told her husband to get rid of them. So he asked another couple, a younger couple that he knew that was UFO knowledgeable. He said, "Hey, I've got a weird skull, weird pair of skulls here. Would you like to see them? We're trying to get rid of them. It's like getting rid of a pet you don't want, So the couple said, "Yeah, we will." And they looked at it, and as soon as they saw the Starchild skull, they said, "Geez, that looks like it could go in the head of a gray. It's just like a gray," in their mind as they remembered grays. So they said, "Yeah, we'll take it." And so they did. And so later they went to the head honcho UFO guy, the MUFON guy. I don't know if you have MUFON here, but we have MUFON there. They went to the top MUFON guy, and they said, he showed him the skull and said, "What can we do with it? How can we get this tested? How can we find out what this is?" And he told them, well, there's a guy out there named Lloyd who does what you saw basically, that presentation. He says, talks about skulls a lot, talks about bones a lot. He's probably the best guy. Plus, he's a good speaker. He's probably the guy you would want to talk to about it. So I get a call out of the blue with some people saying they would like to show me something the next time I'm in their area. And I said, fine, because I assumed it was going to be Bigfoot material because I was at that time getting a lot of Bigfoot stuff because that was my major field. I was not a UFO guy, not a UFO guy at all. So I go to that meeting. They bring in the cardboard box. They open it up and hand the skull to me. And I'm just flabbergasted because I do know a little bit about skulls, and I know what they're supposed to look like. Plus, my father is an optometrist, so I know about eyes. And I see these eye sockets, and I know how bizarre they are. You probably don't, but I did. And I'm feeling that weight, and I spin it over, and I look at the back of the head, and I immediately see that it's missing an Indian, and which we'll talk about in a minute. And I look at him and I say, I really think you have something here. I really think this ought to be tested. And so they said, we would love you to do that for us if you will. I said, well, good. It'll take probably 3 or 4 months to get the money to do this, and we'll have this in maybe 6 months done. And here I stand talking to you 4 years later. 4 years later. That's how stupid I was, and that's how badly I miscalculated the amount of support we would get out of our community, the alternative knowledge community, but also how badly I miscalculated the interest that scientists would show in this. I thought all I had to do was wave it in front of their noses and they would jump all over it with both feet. And all they would do is show me the door as quickly as they could. For the most part, literally, that's what they would do. I showed it to about 60 of them, and 5 of them took the time to actually try to figure it out. And one of them said he was really going to help and I could use his name and the whole 9 yards. And the rest of them, it was basically, please get out of my office as fast as you can. It's the truth. And it isn't that they weren't intrigued. It isn't that they weren't fascinated. It isn't that they didn't go home that night and say to their wife or their significant other, honey, you won't believe what I saw today. It isn't that they didn't know. It's that they can't afford to get involved. It's a third rail. It can kill you. It can kill your career if you get involved with this stuff and it doesn't turn out right. And that's what I didn't understand. But furthermore, I didn't understand that out of the community of alternative knowledge people, I didn't understand how addicted they are to the game, to the hunt for UFOs and aliens. Because again, I wasn't a UFO alien person. I didn't understand how addicted they were to the game and the hunt, and how they didn't really want to know the answer. They liked the process, but didn't want the answer. I know that sounds, bizarre, but that's what I believe happened. So in the end, I looked at it and I said, I'm going to go with this and I'm going to try to make it happen. And I started and I began to research and I began to get some help. And one of the first things we found, one of the first things I did was to notice that if you look at this bone as compared to the human bone, under just a magnifying glass, a good strong magnifying glass. You won't be aware of this, but human bone has a dimpling effect to it. Little dimple here, little dimple there. It isn't like on a golf ball, but it is. There are little dark dents in the bone, little black dents. One here, one here, one here, one here, one here, like that. You look at the Starchild bone and you see the dimples. They're half as deep, and there's about one of them for every 10 on a human skull. So the first thing you can see is there's something about the density of this bone is not right, and yet it weighs half as much. You put it on a scale, it's the same size as a human one, and it weighs out half as much. Something was weird from the very beginning about the bone, but we didn't get it all until just recently. So my first reaction, though, when I saw it was the eyes, because again, my father was an optometrist. I knew a lot about eyes, and these eyes were weird. Next slide. This is a really good close-up of those eyes. Now, that's how they look. And I mean, isn't that just astonishing? Because a human skull should go in like a cone. Grant saw this at the Richard and Judy show with the human skull that they had there. He couldn't believe it. Your finger goes in that deep to an standard eye socket, that deep. Your finger goes into the Starchild not even up to there. It's that much difference. But more importantly, if you take your fingers and you stick them in the upper right-hand corners and you drag them across the middle into the bottom left-hand quadrant, and I'll go do it and show you what I'm talking about. If you put your fingertips here, you'll feel a hollow. If you drag them this way, you will feel a rise. And if you then put them down into this and this, you've got another hollow. Now, visually, you cannot see that. You can look at this, you will not be able to see it. You can put your fingers in, drag them across, and your fingers are sensitive enough to see it. It is that incredibly subtle, the terrain shift in the bone. But it is exact. It is precise in both eyes. Well, what does that mean? That means that anybody that says this is a deformity is wrong right out of the box, because you can't get a deformity to be that symmetrically perfect and that subtle. Only genes can tell something to grow that perfectly. This is a perfect model of whatever it is. It's not a deformity, and it's not human. It's something else. Okay, next slide. This is a comparison. Now you can see a little bit better what I was talking about, the depth of the eye socket. And if you look, you'll see that here, the optic nerve opening right here, and the optic foramen, which is a slit, all the way to the back of the cone, that far in, back of the cone. But here, notice, optic nerve opening, optic foramen, that's where the veins come in to feed the eye, all the way down at the bottom. All this very shallow up here, so that if it's got eyes, they're sitting down here rather than up here. That's pretty weird right away. Now, I had a doctor in Omaha, Nebraska, don't use his name, but he is the guy that if you suffer a traumatic injury to your eyes and lose an eyelid, whether it be ripped off in a car wreck or you lose it in a fire or something like that, and he will rebuild your eyelid with skin from very sensitive places of your body. This is how good this guy is. He is the man. And he was one of the 5 that really spent a lot of time with it and played with those eyes. Up until then, we were assuming that the eyes had to be like flat because they would be sticking out of the head so far. And so when he felt, and he felt a lot, he felt those little dents, and he says, you know, Lloyd, all these subtle little things that you're feeling here, he says, these are connectors for muscles to move eyeballs. So he says, this thing probably it's got the parts, but it's like none I've ever seen. He says, they're going to be down here, and they're going to be smaller, or they're going to be sticking way off the head, way out of the head. And he says, if they've got lids like we do, they're going to have big, long, droopy lids compared to our lids to have to come down to blink over that eye, given where the upper part of the eye is. Now, if you notice on the eye, too, the orbits, the ridges of the eyes, notice, compare here and here. We have the orbits here of the eyes. You feel that, and it's round. It's about the size of a pencil in your finger. It feels like a round, like a straw, like a drinking straw, a pencil, very round. You do this, it's very sharp. You can feel it. It's sharp. There's no brow ridge to this thing. The rise that you see here, the brow ridge that's left from the pre-human era, you know, the hominoids or all that, it's a little bit of it left, and it leaves a dent right in here in the nose. There's no dent here at all. Straight down. No brow ridge. Very, very different. And again, that difference in the quality of the bone, of the texture of the bone. Okay, next slide. This is what really got us going. The first thing we did was we had a fluoroscope done by some doctors in Las Vegas. And they came back to us and they said, well, there's a couple of really interesting things about this. One is it can't possibly be a hydrocephalic because you could see the profile shot of the fluoroscope with the veins running right up from the temple right up to the top of the head. So they said you can see where the veins, where the brain presses into the skull is leaving the track marks. Clearly not a hydrocephalic. But more importantly, this thing has no sinuses. No sinuses at all. Now that's what a human sinus looks like, yours, mine, anybody else's. Like these big cauliflower. It takes up a lot of room in our heads, believe it or not. Not so much as a smidgen here, not even vestigial. Nothing. Nothing. They said that is unusual. Because you can live without sinuses. Believe it or not, a friend of mine had a son born with a little bitty nub right up here between his eyes and the middle of his face absolutely gone. Gone. And he's about 15 years old now, and he talks like this, and they've had to rebuild the whole front of his face, and he'll always talk like this because what your sinuses do is they give you the resonating capacity to make your voice work right. Other than that, they're a real problem. They're germ bags, basically. They're not something we really need except for talking properly. If you can't talk, you don't need sinuses. Keep that in mind. Next slide. Okay, this side view, and this really gives us a clear image of what we're looking at here. First thing I want you to focus on is this brace bone right here that presses into the maxilla of the human, and the Starchild has it too, and it just shows you it's about half the length, and so it means its maxilla is going to be about half the size. And really that's true because everything about the Starchild is greatly reduced in the lower face than is the face of the human. But also notice that you've got the same bones, frontal bone, sphenoids, temporal, parietal, and back here, the occipital. It's the same parts reconfigured and the bone reconstituted. It's the same as happened from the so-called pre-humans, the Neanderthals and whatever, to humans. Really, same parts, but reconfigured and the bone reconstituted. Okay? So, notice, if you will, the shape here of the head, absolutely flat and back to that point. This is a standard classic cradle-boarded head. Now, it's important to know that because scientists look at this and they say, oh, cradle-boarded hydrocephalic. You got this bulge here, you got this flattening back here, it has to be a cradle-boarded hydrocephalic. When in reality, it's easy to prove that it's neither of those. Again, you have the fluoroscope. You can see it on the website, starchildproject.com. I've lost the slide, unfortunately. But you can see the veins tracking right up through here, right to the top. You can look with a flashlight, you can look up and see that the vein tracks go right to the top. There's no water on that brain. That brain is pressing up all the way around. Now, as far as the cradle boarding goes, when you have a true standard cradle boarded head, what it means is that the mother, and this is very common practice, straps the baby to a board to put it on her back. And you've got to tie the head down because if mom does her usual thing of stooping, fetching, doing like this all the time, baby's head's going to snap and break off. You've got to tie it down on the board. Well, after a babyhood of that, you come out with the back of your head as flat as the board. I've felt several of them, and they're all just flat as that can be. Flat as the board. Whereas the Starchild head is not flat at all. It looks it, but you can feel it with your own hands. You'll feel the convolutions in back. It was never cradle boarded. Never cradle boarded. It grew that way because its genes told it to grow that way. It also told it to grow no inion. Now this is the inion, and this is real important, so I want everybody to do it. Reach around, feel to the back of that knot on the back of your head. This is real important. It's called the inion, and feel right underneath it. First thing you feel is muscles attached to it, right? It's where your neck begins. Your neck attaches, there are two big muscles attached here, but that knot is the beginning of your neck, and from here all the way down here through here, that's neck for a normal human. Now with the Starchild, there is no inion. Not only that, the inion is a dent. You can feel that as well. You can see it. It's a dent. So it comes down, and its neck doesn't begin till down here. So its neck is this little bitty thing right here. Its neck is about the third size of ours. Pretty weird. But its chewing muscles, we're going to look at that right now. If you see this is the zygomatic arch here, the cheekbone would come through here. I could stick two fingers through this head, which is, they're both about the same size. I can stick two fingers up through the zygomatic arch, and that's how thick the chewing muscles are. And they come up through here. You can see the line on the skull. It's very clear. You can see the line right here, coming through, down, 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 coming around, coming around, coming around. That's the chewing muscles all attaching through here. With the Starchild, you've got the zygomatic arch starts right there, and it's little, and you can get maybe a couple of drinking straws through there if it was there, and it only comes up through about right there, about 1/3 what it does over here. Next slide. Human versus Starchild. It's amazing, and you can see the little pocking of the bones where the muscles attach to it. It's amazing. Now, how do you suppose in deformity something detaches the muscles from where they should be and reattaches them down here? Next slide. Okay, here we see the rear shot, rear view, and look at that. See the inion, the knot right here? Look at those two big dents there where the muscles attach, and all through here. And you can see the Starchild, that's its inion, because this is so pressed up, gone, and you see the two dents right here for the neck muscles attaching all the way down here. This is wrapping around. It's completely different. Look how much press up you have here for the occipital, parietal, and you can kind of see the dent here, the classic dent of the gray head. You know, they always have that heart shape with the little dent on the top. Here you go. There's your classic dent. You're looking at it, and that's one of the reasons. See what it normally looks like? So that's one of the reasons that the people thought, this could be the head of a gray, skull that goes in a gray. Next slide. Now this is me holding it so that you can see not only where the neck attachment goes versus the inion, but also the islands. Now these are real important. See these islands here? That's what they're called. These bone connectors between the suture lines. When you're born, your head is a series of plates with ligaments connecting those plates together so your head can fit through the birth canal. And then over the next couple of years, they suture together. They grow together at the seam lines. That's where your head grows, at the suture lines. The last part to heal is the one at the top where three things come together, and that's called the soft spot. You with me? So, what this indicates is this is not a child. We were told it was a child at the beginning because I'll show you in a minute. There was a piece of maxilla, and we did that fluoroscope, and they said, well, this thing has teeth up in the top and teeth on down. It's got to be a child. But they weren't really that knowledgeable about it. But later, skull experts said, oh, no, you got islands like this. You're looking at something well up in maturity, 20, 30 years old, maybe more, to get that. So it's really not a Starchild. Not a child. Doesn't look like it if you judge by this. Okay, next slide. This is the neck connectors. So you see the inion and the two big muscle attachments and the difference in neck size. About a third, again, just like the chewing muscles, about a third of what it ought to be. Pretty weird. Next slide. Okay, this is the neck where the foramen magnums are, where the spine goes into the head. And if you look at the human, you see the difference. Ours is set to the rear of center because our face is hollow. We have all those sinuses, you saw that. We have our big nasal passages. We have our mouths. We're hollow up here. We have our chins and voice box and all that. So you have to put it back of center to get a good balance point. With this, it's dead center because It's not hollow. There's no sinuses. There's no deep eye sockets going in, taking up room. And, you know, there may not be a neck or a voice box the way we have, because the neck is so small. But in any event, it sits on that skinny little neck it has. You can see the size of this neck versus this little bitty neck here. It sits on that little neck like a weird shaped golf ball. It's sitting up on a tee. Now, guess what? That's got better balance than we do. You can take like any heavy stick or like a baseball bat or whatever and hold it in your hand, and if you hold it vertically, it's pretty easy to hold. You tilt it even 1 or 2 degrees off of straight up and suddenly you have strain. That's why our neck apparently has to be so big, because our neck's not balanced right. That neck, the head is set so that it balances, you know, it's like holding the thing vertically for whatever reason. All right, next slide. The balance point. See the difference? Now, the brains in here, let's talk about those for a minute because it's pretty interesting. This is a human about the size of a 12-year-old. And remember, it's small, about 5 feet tall. It's about the size of a normal 12-year-old. That brain should be 1,200 cubic centimeters in there. The Starchild's the same size. So it should have a brain capacity of 1,200 cubic centimeters. But guess how much it has? 1,600 cubic centimeters of brain in this head. Now, that's amazing. What an efficient use of space. It's just wall-to-wall brain. It's as much brain as you can cram in there. It's 200 cubic centimeters more than your brain or my brain. We average 1,400 cubic centimeters, those of us in this room. 1,400. It's 200 more. But it's fully 1/3, again, more than what it ought to be, 1,200 to 1,600. It's a huge brain, a huge, huge leap. 200 cubic centimeters, a leap in brain is a leap in species. Homo habilis, Homo erectus, that's a 200 cubic centimeter jump. Homo erectus to Homo archaic, that's a 200 centimeter jump. It's a big deal. What do you need that much brain for? Well, if you've got a little bitty neck without a voice box and you can't speak, maybe you need it to communicate telepathically. It's possible, and there are reasons to believe that might be the case. Next slide. Okay, this is a look at the top. Remember I was telling you about the suture points, the soft spot? See how nice and sealed up it is? Not a problem. And you get, again, a real pretty clear shot here of the V, the dent. Okay? It's got the look of the gray. Next slide. Now this is the piece of maxilla that came with it. This little piece right here, but it was detached. You see these two teeth? This is a molar, and this is a bicuspid. But up in here, you've got 4 other teeth. 2 here and 2 here. But you're missing a hole. You're missing a spot. One of the bicuspids, there should be room for a bicuspid here that's not there. Well, that makes sense because it's a much reduced mouth. It's a much reduced, and it's a very flat roof. It isn't arched up, it's flat. You can see in the replica that we've made of the lower jaw. But interestingly, this bicuspid right here, I finally got an expert to look at it. She said, you know, this is really weird because this is how a molar is supposed to look at the root, but a bicuspid is supposed to bifurcate, meaning split, up in the bone, much higher than that. But look, she said, you can see the split on this bicuspid. So she said, this is, not only does it show wear down on the crowns, nothing like the human, by the way. The human's teeth are really worn heavily. Nothing like that, but she said the enamel is crazed, meaning it's cracked. She said that's 20 years or more of life and hard times and hard chewing. The enamel is crazed. So she said, it's not a child. She said, what it might be is a being that lives very, very long and needs multiple sets of teeth and can grow them. So that might be what we're looking at here. We don't know, but it's not a child and it's not a normal human in that sense. Next slide. Okay, this is a CAT scan that we had done of the brain, and what it really shows is that all the sutures were alive and growing. Now, what experts will say is that, there must have been some synostosis, which means freezing of the sutures to cause the brain, the head to grow weird and the brain to go weird and all that. Synostosis, premature closing of the sutures. We had a CAT scan done, and the guy said, no, 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 no. So they're all open, they're all healthy. This was a very healthy creature when it died, whatever it was. No, and no possibility of deformity in that way. Next slide. Now what this shows very interestingly is he looked at it and he says, whoa, 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 whoa. He says, this thing has much bigger inner ears than we have. I wonder what that's about. This is eyes, of course. But bigger inner ears, what would that be about? Would need better balance? For what reason? Well, hold that head up maybe. But anyway, larger inner ears. Take it for what it's worth. Next slide. This is a forensic drawing that I like the look of, and for a number of reasons. Remember the guy talking about the eyes and how they would have to be down and have that upper, heavy upper lid? The nose could be pretty right. Oh, I'm sorry, but on that piece of maxilla, I forgot to show you, there's a little dent in the bone that shows that it did have nasal passages. It did have the ability to breathe through a nose in the way that we have. It did have a nasal passage. So it did have a nose. So the nose, the mouth, I think the chin's a little heavy, but he was making an ovoid shape, and I think it would be cut off a little bit. I think it would be smaller, but it's a good attempt, and I appreciate it very much. Mark Savy did it. Okay, next slide. Oops, back the wrong way. There you go. Okay, this is a Fate magazine cover where they did a big story on it, and this is I think a really cool graphic where a guy took his daughter and he morphed the features to look kind of like that graphic that we had. The eyes still up, too high, it would be down here, but still, that's pretty arresting, isn't it? I've always liked that image. So, next slide. Now, this is really an interesting story, and I'll stop for a minute and go over a part of it that really applies to the Starchild. It turns out that people would come to me and say, do you know about the star being legends? Do you know about the star? You've heard anything about it? No, I haven't. I'm not a UFO person. I don't know about it. Well, you should really look into that. And so I did. And I found that there was a lady at UCLA, a recently retired professor emeritus named Paula Gunn Allen, who had spent her research career researching the star being legends. And what they are is this. Throughout the Americas, and probably around the world, but they've mostly been researched in the Americas, there are these stories of beings coming down from the heavens to primitive villages that are going back hundreds of years from Tierra del Fuego all the way up to the Eskimos, but going back for hundreds of years, and they would come and they would isolate a village, pick a village with a woman in it who was barren, and they would make her pregnant with a hybrid being of her and the gods, human and the gods. And she would be told, and the village would be told, she is going to give birth to a star being, and you will be tasked, all of you, with helping her to raise this baby up to the age of 5 or 6 or 7 or 8, and we'll come back and get it. And they would do that. And that was the program, supposedly. And the reason being, for what it's worth, is that the Greys have no capacity to give emotion, emotion. And so when in their early experiments, the beings that they would create would have enough human in them to where they would fail to thrive for lack of interaction, for lack of nurturing. And we know from psychological studies that if you are nurtured well from 0 to the age of 6, you can withstand almost anything in later life. But if you are not, if you are very poorly nurtured up to the age of 6, nothing can be done to repair you. The damage is done and it's permanent. So probably their first attempts failed to thrive, and so they set this system up where they would let the human mothers nurture them until they were up to the age where they needed to be, and then they would come get them to take them to do whatever they wanted. Now, again, these are myths. These are not written in stone like the Sumerian tablets, so you can't go to the wall as hard with them as you can with those tablets. But still, those legends are out there, and they're widespread. But they end at about 100 years ago, 100 to 120 years ago, when the world began to get smaller with its communications, shrinking the world so that you couldn't have a being like that living anywhere and have the tabloids not know about it. So that program stopped, and a new program was put in its place, and that program is called harvesting. Now again, this is only anecdotal evidence coming from women who tell the story, but there's a lot of them telling it. I know at least a dozen now, And it makes your skin crawl to hear it. But what they say is this. They are taken on board a craft. They are made pregnant. They come home. They are pregnant. They go to the doctor in a couple of months. They're pregnant. They get the sound scan. They can see the fetus. There's no doubt about it. It's on record. There are many records of this. There are books done about it called the twin effect, because a lot of times it's twins, but a lot of times it's not. And in the fourth month, in the first month of the second trimester, somewhere, they're going to wake up and have every sign of a miscarriage except no fetus. And they have been harvested. And then later, some years later, anywhere from 5 to 10 or even 15 years, they will be taken back on board and they will be shown what is alleged to be their hybrid children, and they will be told to spend time, bond, have any relationship you want with your children or child. Now, it's horrifying, I know, to hear this, but nonetheless, this is an ongoing story that women tell all over the world, that they're being harvested. So one of them contacts me, named Josie Valenti, and she says, Lloyd, I've been harvested 4 times, and I was taken on board and I saw 2 of my children, and I was allowed to interact with them, and I have a good memory of it, and I'm an artist and I drew them. Would you like to see them? And so I said, yes, of course. And she said, and I did it back in 96. I said, great. So she did. This is her 12-year-old daughter as she remembered it. Okay, next slide. This is her 8-year-old son. She polished it up a little bit for me, but she said, basically, this is it. Now, that's very Starchild-like. Check the profile of the kid. Next slide. Look at that. Pretty remarkable. Now, keeping this in mind, there was a man taken on board in the early 1990s. Don't use his name, but he was so freaked out, and he had some money, he had a sculptor do a bust of the beings that took him on board their craft and dealt with him. And he worked with that sculptor, and he made him get it just right. And the sculptor kept having trouble, but they worked together on it for a long time, and he paid for it, and he got it, and he sent me a picture of it. Check this out. 92, this happened. Look at this. More than that, check the front view. Next slide. Look at those eyes, folks. This is a guy in 92 now. Way before the Starchild came to light. Pretty interesting. Not perfect, just like the drawings. You know, they can quibble about little points, but awful close. Well into the ballpark. Next slide. Okay, now this is really interesting to me. This is a book called A Visual Guide to Alien Beings by David Chase. Okay? Here it is right here. If we don't have copies here, but if you're interested in getting a copy of this book, you can get it through Greenleaf Publications in the States. Greenleafpublications.com. What this is a book by a young man who called people, and he said, anybody out there that thinks they saw an alien and would like to tell somebody about it and have them draw it, please get in touch with me. And he did. And he called, and he used a lot of his own stuff as well. But you've got a book filled, literally filled. And a lot of them, if you see it close, have babies in test tubes, walls of babies growing up in test tubes from women who tell this story of seeing the babies growing. So what you see is hundreds of them, and you can look at this at the back table with the skull as well. What you see is the grouping that he came up with. Now, he said he didn't put the insectoids up here because they're so gross and he didn't want to scare people, but to me the reptilians are just as scary. But the insectoid would be here, reptilians, the Anunnaki, Pleiadians, whatever you want to call the human ones that basically we descend from. And then you have the different grays. You have the little blue men down here in the corner that are, I didn't even know about them. He said they're the rarest ones. People see them the least. But you have the different grays, and then you have the hybrid, the one that's kind of flesh-colored there to the side. You see that? Now, the Starchild could well be one of those. Could well be one of those. But it's all very interesting just that such things exist. Okay, now, next slide. Now we're going to tie it all up and bring it on home. This is a Neanderthal to the left and a human to the right. And what you saw earlier and what you have very clearly is a reconfiguration of the same bones, frontal bones, sphenoid, parietal, but a complete reconfiguration to the point where we share nothing with them genetically. Very little. I mean, very little. It's clear that we did not descend from them. It's like we share stuff with mice. We're not them. It's a reconfiguration of the bone. And it's making different kind of bone. It's much lighter. It's a reconstitution of the bone. If you were to put the Starchild right here, the difference between it and the human would be no different than it and the Neanderthal. And furthermore, the feet are the same thing. Remember the feet? The same bone, reconfigured, reconstituted. If you were to put the Starchild's feet, if we had them, it would probably, we could say the same thing. Reconfigured, reconstituted. I think, to me, this is all compelling enough evidence to indicate that we should be doing what we're doing, which is getting the DNA of the Starchild tested. Well, that's basically it then. Thank you very much. The right half from the middle all the way over, and these were the two teeth right here.
Okay.
You see how it worked? It's missing. But it's, again, see, it's much smaller. You see how flat the roof is? It's not really normal. But this is as close as we have to what we think it might have looked like. Okay? Now, as you see up close, you see it's got all the things that I was telling you about, the indentation where the inion was, the two spots where the neck attached. You see this little ridge right here? You can see it in the light here really good. We think the neck, we don't have that in ours because ours overlaps, but we think the neck circled around right there. You can stick your finger in here. I didn't discuss this in the slide presentation, but you can stick your finger in here and feel this ridging. It should be twice as big in a human. They think there may even not be a cerebellum in here, and your cerebellum is your motor part of your brain. So that too is another very big difference. But it's, since we do have some part of it here, I don't talk about it too much.
Where is the skull back in America?
It's back in America, yes, safekeeping with the owners, right, yeah. Now,
Sort of a whole body physiognomy from the